TailWind CSS is a CSS framework that allows you to style your components without writing a single line of CSS. Instead, you apply predefined classes to HTML elements directly, and through variations in these class names, you're able to control the styling that you're applying to these elements. I also really like the way that TailWind CSS handles responsive design. There is a set of predefined breakpoints, but TailWind is actually mobile first, so the classes that you apply to your elements will actually affect and apply to mobile, and then as you scale up to larger devices like tablets and desktop, you can prefix additional classes on those elements with the breakpoint that you're targeting, and then as you hit those breakpoints, the classes that are prefixed will actually override those initial base styles. TailWind also uses responsive CSS measurement units. I'm talking about REMs, and that means that it is really good for accessibility. In this tutorial, we're going to be using TailWind CSS with React to build a responsive landing page. Let's take a quick look at the application we'll be working on. I am using Create React App, but in the source directory, I've deleted most of the files that it created. The only files that I've kept is app.js, which is a simple function that just returns hello world, and then index.js, which is the root of our application. And again, all I'm doing here is rendering the app component. And I have also downloaded some assets that we'll use in our landing page. I have 2 images and a logo. Before we can start working with TailWind CSS, we have to install it. They've created a really easy guide on their website, which is tailwindcss.com. You can either click a link I'll add into the description of this video, or you can search for it yourself. But once you come to this website, you just have to go ahead and click on Get Started, go to the documentation, and then select Create React App, which is the implementation we'll be using. So for us to configure TailWind CSS with Create React App, all we have to do is follow these instructions. They're very simple and easy to follow, so let's go ahead and do it. So the first thing we need to do is just install TailWind via npm. So these are the dependencies that we need. So I'm going to copy that, come back over to VS Code. I'm just going to open up a new terminal window, and I'm going to paste in the command that they've provided. Now it's going to take a few minutes for that to install. The second step is for us to install Krakow, which is an alternative to React scripts, and we're going to use that and update our npm scripts here. But the reason we need to do that is because we need to override our post CSS configuration, which is of course a Webpack plugin, and this is just to do with how we build our application. So all we need to do is just copy this command, come back over to VS Code. We're just going to paste that command and install Krakow. Again, whilst that's running in the background, I'm going to come back over to the documentation. And then we just need to update our npm scripts. So I'm just going to copy these new commands. And again, we're just replacing the start, build, and test scripts. So let's come back over to VS Code. So those have both finished installing. We need to open up our package.json file. I'll close my terminal window. And let's come down to our npm scripts. So we want to replace the first 3 scripts, which is for start, build, and test. And we're just going to replace those with the ones that we've taken from the documentation. So it's literally just a copy and paste. Again, let's come back over to the documentation, and then we need to create our configuration file for Krakow. So again, we're going to call it krakow.config.js, and that needs to be created in the root directory of our project. And within that file, we just have to copy this code. So I'm going to take that and just copy and paste it into the file I've created. And then we can come back over to the documentation, and we need to run this command within our terminal. So again, I'm going to launch a new terminal window. I'm going to paste in that command, and that's going to initialize TailWind CSS within our project. So it's just created a configuration file for TailWind, and then I can come back over to the documentation, and I just have to update the files that we're going to purge. So I'm going to copy this line, and I'm going to override the default value, which is an empty array, with that I've taken from the documentation. And again, this is just specific to Create React App and the files and the way that this project is created. So we can save those changes, and again, come back over to the documentation, and we just have a single step left. So we have to create an index.css file within our source directory and import the core components of the TailWind CSS library. So these are those default styles that the library is built on. So within our source folder, I'm going to create a new file. We're going to call this index.css, and then within that we're going to paste in those 3 imports, and we're going to save the file. And again, in the documentation, all we have to do is import that into the root of our application, which is index.js. So let's come back over to index.js, and let's just add that import. And if you followed all of those steps correctly, then you will have configured TailWind CSS with Create React App and your application. Now, before we start building out the application, writing our components, it's really important that we consider the project architecture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install another dependency, which is React Router DOM, because we're going to be using this not only to set up our routes, we're also going to be using this to handle our page layouts and our page components. So I'm going to go ahead and install React Router DOM as another npm dependency. Once we've installed that, I'm going to go ahead and close that terminal window, and I'm going to come back into the root of my application, which is index.js, and I'm going to import the browser router. So let's import that from React Router DOM. So again, we need to import the browser router, and then I'm just going to wrap my application with the browser router. So once I've done that, I can save those changes and come back into app.js. And at the moment, what we're doing is we are just returning this simple div with hello world. I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to import 2 more things at the top of the file. Again, that's going to be from React Router DOM, and that's going to be this switch component and the route component. Once I've done that, what I can do is I can go ahead and use those components. So I'm going to have my switch component, and then within that I'm going to have each of my individual routes. Now, of course, in this tutorial we're only building a single landing page, so I'm going to make that my home page. So the path here is just going to be /, and then within this route is where we're going to render our layout and page components. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to extract the common components from this page. So that includes the header, the footer, and even this hero banner. And I'm going to put that into a layout. And then for the content of the page, I'm going to pass in a page component. And the page component is only going to contain the content for this page. So in this case, it's these 3 cards here. And of course, all of this is going to be completely responsive. As you can see on mobile, we have a single column. Tablet, we have a 2 column. And on desktop, we have a 3 column layout. But we're going to be managing this with layout components and page components. So within the source directory, I'm going to create a new file. We're going to put this inside of layouts. We're going to have a landing page, and then index.js. So all we need to do is just import React from React. It's going to be a function. It's going to be a functional component. So we'll just call this our landing page layout, right? we'll just store any props passed in for now in other props. And let's just return for now an empty div. And let's not forget to do our default export here of our landing page layout. Okay, so what we can then do is come back over to app.js into our route, and we're just going to import that layout. Right, so this will be where we import our layouts. So let's just import our landing page layout. We'll import that from layouts, landing page, and then we will render that layout here within our route. And as I said before, we're going to pass in a page component to this layout, which we're going to use to render the content of this page. So what I'm also going to do is within my source folder, I'm going to create another new file. This one is going to be inside of a pages directory, and we're going to call this our home page. And we'll create index.js inside of that. And again, this is just going to be a simple functional component. We'll just import React from React. We'll create that component, so it's going to be a simple function. So we'll just say const home page. Again, we'll just get any props passed in and store that in other props. And we'll have a return statement here. We'll just return a simple div at this time. And let's not forget to do our default export of home page. And then on, again, app.js, we'll have another section here at the top where we import our page components. And I'm just going to import that home page. So we'll import that from pages, home page, and we're going to pass that into our layout component. So this is how we're going to structure our landing page. We're just going to have our layout and then our page component passed in as a child to that layout component. The first component that we want to build is our header component. This white block, we have links on the far right side of our header. We have a logo on the far left side of it. It's also completely responsive, so if I resize the browser, you'll see that it is a responsive navigation. So to build that, let's come back over to our source directory. Let's create our components folder. And inside of that, we're going to create our header and then index.js inside of that. So at the top of the file, we're going to import React from React, and then we're going to create our function. So we'll say header. Again, we're going to take any props that are passed into the component, and then we're going to have a simple return statement here where we return our header, and we're going to have our default export of our header. So I need to first of all render the header component. So I'm going to come back over to my layout. So this is my landing page layout. I'm going to import my header. So I'll import that from the components folder. So we'll import the header, and then we'll just render, for now, we'll just render our header component here within our layout. So now if I come back over to the header component, I can import some of those assets. So I mentioned at the start of the tutorial that I had created some assets here, some images and a logo. I actually have the TailWind CSS logo. First of all, I'm going to import my logo from my assets folder. So my assets / my logo. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to render that out. I'm going to put that in a div. So I'm going to have an image here. I'm going to render the logo. And I'm also just going to go ahead and create a navigation. So I'm going to put that in a nav with an unordered list. We're going to have some list items. Before I can create a link, we're using React Router DOM. So I need to import the link component. So we'll import React Router DOM. We're going to create our links. So what I can do is just render some links here. I'm just going to say page, and I'll duplicate this 3 times. All right, so now that we actually have some content on the page, let's actually take a look at TailWind CSS and figure out how to apply some of that styling. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is background colors, because I think that's the most obvious thing that I can show you. So I've just come to TailWind CSS and I've just searched for the CSS property that I want to apply to the element. So in this case, that's a background color. And as you can see, they provide a huge list of different classes with variations. So as you can see, 300 is a different shade of indigo than 400 and 500, etc. And it's the same with every color in this list. So I have a huge variety of colors here that I can apply to any element on the page. So for example, if I wanted a dark red, I could take this class and then I could come back over to VS Code and to my header, and I can apply that class, and then you'll see that that color is immediately applied to that element. Now, something else that's really important for you to understand is that TailWind CSS is completely responsive out the box. And in fact, it uses responsive measurement units. In this case, it uses percentages and rems, or root ems. This is really good for things like accessibility, because it allows the user to dictate how they want to use your website. So as I said, I've already got this example of what we'll be building in this tutorial series. And because we are using responsive measurement units, we're using rems through TailWind CSS. Let me show you what happens when I resize the page. So I'm going to change the default font size on the browser. I'm going to change it to very large. And you're going to see that everything is automatically resized on the page. Everything becomes much larger. So anyone who might struggle to use your website can change that default setting on the browser, and they'll be able to see and use your website much more easily. The same way I can scale it down. So if I was to change the default font size on the browser to very small, then again, everything on the site automatically resizes. I don't have to add any media queries. I don't have to change a single line of CSS. It happens for me for free. And this is why it's very important for you to use responsive measurement units like rems in your projects, because it helps with accessibility, and that will help you with not only your users, but it will also help you with things like search engine optimization, because one of the things that Google will rank you for is accessibility. So that's very important that you use responsive measurement units, and that's something that you're going to get for free from TailWind. Now, whilst that might make sense to you, you might be looking at these numbers and really just wondering what they mean. So I'm going to show you how you can calculate rems. So let's just take our calculator here, and let me show you 20 rems, how you calculate that as a pixel value. So all I have to do is take 20 rems and then times that by the default browser font size, which is 16 pixels, and that tells me that 20 rems is the equivalent of 320 pixels. I can also do that in reverse. So if I wanted to find out what, for example, 1280 pixels is in rems, I could divide that by 16 pixels, and that will tell me that it is the equivalent of 80 rems. So something that I want to do here is I want to set the default content width on my page. I want to set that to 1280 pixels, right? And I want to center that on the page, because if I look at this currently, it's just edge to edge. It's full width, and that's not what I want. I want to center my content in the middle of the page. So to do that, I want to set that to be 1280 pixels. The equivalent, as I already showed you, is 80 rems. So I'm going to take the class that corresponds with that width, and I'm going to come back over to VS Code, and I'm going to add a wrapper around my logo and my navigation, and I'm going to apply that class name. Now I also want to center my content, and I can tell you right now that to do that I just have to apply MX Auto. That is the class here, so to center. So this will set the margin on the x-axis, which is right and left, to auto for both. So I can add that class and save it, and then I can come back over to the browser, and you'll see that it is set that default content max width of 1280 pixels, and it has centered it on the page. Now, something else that I want to do here is I want to change that background color to white. So I'll just go ahead and do that. And then you can see that this is starting to look a lot more like the header that I showed you we'll be working on from our complete version. It's important that you understand how responsive design works with TailWind CSS. So everything that you do in TailWind is mobile first. The classes that you apply to your elements will apply to mobile, and then if you want to override those classes on larger devices like desktop or tablet, you'll have to prefix additional classes on that element with a breakpoint. Now these are the breakpoints that TailWind provides out of the box, and these are the corresponding widths in pixel values that you can see here for each of those breakpoints. Now we will be using this in this tutorial, so if this doesn't make sense right now, then just bear with me. But let's now head back over to VS Code and let's start actually styling out our header. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to make my header relative. So I'll just apply the relative class here. Now what I want to do here is I want to have my image on the far left, my navigation on the far right. So to do that, I'm going to use flex. I'm going to set this to be display flex on the wrapper, and I'm also going to set I'm going to justify the content using between. That's going to set the logo and the navigation on the far left and right, and then I'm centering them vertically using items center. Then I want to style my logo. So to do that, the first thing I need to do is make my logo 100% width. So to do that, I can just set W-full. That's going to apply a 100% width to that image. And then I need to apply a width to the logo. And if I come back over here to TailWind, I'll just search for width. And if I actually look here, what I want is actually 3.5 rem, which has a class of W-14. So if I come back over to VS Code, I can just paste in that width, and that will apply my chosen width to that element. And then I can style up my navigation. So what I actually need to do, as I said, is style this mobile first. And on mobile, I want this to actually be a burger menu, which means that I will only conditionally render the navigation based on if the user has clicked on some kind of icon or text. In this case, we're going to have some text. So I'm going to have a div here that just says menu, and if someone clicks on this, it will toggle the navigation on mobile. So to toggle that, what we'll need to do is import the use state hook from React, and at the top of the function we need to use that. So we'll just set this to be active, and we'll create our setter here. So we'll say set active, and then we'll call the use state hook, and the default value of course will be false. And then we need to create our onClick handler. So we'll say const.onClick equals, it's going to be a function that just calls our setter and toggles the value of active. And we can pass that, of course, on the onClick event to our div here. Now, of course, that would be useless unless we're toggling a class on our nav to actually hide and show the navigation. So I'm going to use backticks here, so that what I can apply here is based on if active is false, then we want to apply the hidden class. So if we actually look at this now in the browser, you'll see that we are by default, we're hiding the navigation. If I toggle menu, if I click it, we show the navigation. But of course, as you can see, we don't want it to be here on the far right. We want it to sit underneath on mobile. So let's come back over to VS Code, and we'll apply some additional classes on this nav element to position it underneath our mobile. So firstly, we want to set this to be absolute. Then we need to use display flex. we want to set the flex direction to be column, so we'll say flex col. We want to set the background color to be white, so we'll just say BG white. We want to set the position from the top to be the full width of the header. Of course, this is absolute, so it won't be, the height of the navigation itself won't be a factor, but we'll say top dash full. And then we want to make this full width with 100% width, so we'll just say W dash full. And we want to set this on to be sitting on the left side of the window, so we'll just say left dash 0 to give it a left margin of 0. And then we want to always make sure this sits on top of all the content when it is open, so we'll give it a Z index of 20. So if I now save this, we're ready to move on from that particular element, and what we can actually start to style is our list items. So for our list items, at least initially what we want to set here is the list style type. We'll just say list none. And then for our links, we need to apply some additional classes here as well. So again, we want this to be full width. So again, we'll use flex and we'll set W dash full, which is going to give it a 100% width. And then we want to handle the font size. So let's come back over here to TailWind and let's do a search for font size. And as you can see here, there is a class here called text base, which is equal to 1 rem, which is basically the equivalent of saying 16 pixels, because it's basically 1 rem is the exact size, the default font size of the browser, which we know is, of course, 16 pixels. So we'll say that the font size should be text base. We want to set the font to be uppercase, and we want to set a hover state, which we're going to set to be basically a dark red. So we'll just say text red, and it's going to be a shade of 600, which is slightly darker. And then we want to make sure that we use a cursor of pointer. So we'll just say, we're going to say cursor dash pointer. And then this is where we want to apply some padding. So to do this, what we'll do is we want some padding on the top, first of all. So we'll say PT dash 2.5. And we want padding on the right and left, which is the x-axis. So we'll say px-2.5 as well. So let's save that, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this entire list item, and I'm just going to overwrite these two other list items underneath. Let's save those changes, and we can view this again in the browser. Something else that we need to do is add some padding to our header in general, because as you can see, it's touching the sides. So let's come back over to VS Code. And whereas before, to apply padding on the right and left, we used the x-axis. If we just wanted to apply it all the way around the element, what we can do is, again, just on our wrapper here, we just prefix with p alone. So we just say p-2.5. And if I do that, I come back over, you'll see that's adding 10 pixels of padding all the way around our header. And now if I toggle the nav, you'll see that this looks much more neat and tidy. So we can start to now think about desktop. So if I was to change the layout of the console, you'll see that we still have our mobile navigation on desktop. So what I want to do is I want to take the breakpoint. So again, if I come over and look at the responsive design, we have this mid breakpoint, which is 768. So after 768, after this breakpoint, we can override the styles to make this make our navigation sit in line, right? So to do that, let's come back over to the code and let's come back down to our nav wrapper here. And I need to change some of the classes that have been applied. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that it's not absolute. So we'll prefix this with the breakpoint of MD, and it's very important that you don't apply any spaces here. And we're going to set that to be position static. We then want to set the the width instead of from being 100%, we want to make it auto. And then we need to override the flex direction to be row. So we'll say flex. So again, we'll say MD flex dash row. And then we also need some margin between the items. So on each of these list items, I am going to set a right margin. So margin right dash 5. And then I'm going to copy that into each of these other list items. The next thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that regardless if this hidden class is applied or not, right, that we're always displaying this on larger devices. So again, we're going to prefix with that breakpoint, and we're just going to say flex. And that will override this hidden class on larger devices, regardless if it's applied or not, because we've applied that here using this breakpoint. And then finally, we need to apply some classes to our toggle button so that this only shows on mobile. So again, what we're going to do is on larger devices, we're going to hide it. So we'll just give it the hidden class, but we're going to set the font to be uppercase. Okay, so let's view this in the browser. And as you can see, this is still not working quite right for us. These are not inline. So let's come back over to VS Code. And it's because we have this additional wrapper here. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to set this class to the unordered list here. And then let's view that again in the browser, and that looks correct. So as you can see, we've now managed to style our header. So if I now resize this, we have our mobile navigation, and also on desktop, we have a full width inline version of our navigation. The next thing that we want to work on is our hero. This is where we're going to have our background image and our heading, our page heading. So we're going to be building this in our layout component. Now, before we can actually do that, I just want to inspect the page. And what you're going to see is that unfortunately we can't make our TailWind CSS components the full height of the page because the HTML and the body is not 100%. As you can see, it's kind of collapsing on itself. So we do need to make one change to our HTML file. This is where, again, we render our application. And on the HTML, we need to set a custom style tag here. And we need to set the height to be 100%. We need to add that here. And we also need to add it to the body. And we also need to add it to the root, which is where we render our application. Okay, let's save that and come back over. And if we come back now into the browser and I inspect this again, I reload the page, you're going to see that the body is now the full height of the screen. So when we actually render our application, we'll be able to manage that with TailWind CSS. And that's going to be important because the layout of our page is this banner image has to take up the full height of the screen. Now to do that, I can search TailWind for min height, and I have these three options. I have either 0 pixels, I have 100%, or 100 vertical height. Now we want this class, which is going to apply 100% to my wrapper. So what I'm going to do is come back over to VS Code, and I'm going to head over to my landing page component. And again, I'm going to apply that class here, which is going to give the wrapper 100% height. I then want to add a gray background color. So I'm going to use BG-gray-100, which again is a shade of gray that I want to apply. And then I'm going to wrap my header in another div with another wrapper. And I'm going to apply some additional classes here. And I actually want this to be 100 vertical height. So if I come back over now again to TailWind and I just search for height, so not min height, but height, h-screen is 100 vertical height, which is what I want to apply here. So I'm going to grab that class as well, and I'm going to apply that here to the wrapper. And then I also want to set the display here. So I want this to be flex, and I want this to be a flex direction of flex call, right? So those are the classes for those wrappers. Then I'm going to render my header. I don't really have to do anything with that, but then I want to render my banner image. So this is going to be the div tag that contains my banner image. So the first thing I need to do is I need to import my hero image, which I have here in my assets. So I need to import this image here into the component. Again, you can import any image that you might want to use yourself. That's going to come from assets/hero.jpg. And then on the div tag itself, I'm going to style this inline. So I'm going to set the style tag, and then we're going to set the background image, and we're just going to set that image. So it's going to be URL, and then we'll use string interpolation to set the background image to be my hero image. And then finally, we just need to apply some classes to our hero here. So the first thing that I want to set is that it should be relative. And then I need to set this to be display flex. I want the items to be centered. So this is going to be vertically aligning basically my heading that I'm going to have inside eventually. So we'll set items to center. Again, we want to center this horizontally as well. So we'll just say justify center. And then we also want this to be the full height of the parent. So I'm going to set the height to full, which is going to give it 100% height. And then we want to apply some CSS properties to handle the sizing and positioning of this background image. So what I'm going to set here is that the background size should be set to cover. We want to center it, so we'll say BG center. We want to set it to be fixed, which is going to give it that parallax effect. So we'll say BG fixed. And then also we want to make sure that the image doesn't repeat. So we'll just say BG no repeat. We'll save that. And then finally, what I also want to do here is I want to have a heading, right? So this is going to be my page heading, my H1, and I'm going to get that from props. I'm going to pass that into the component. So I'm going to have this as my heading text, which is going to be this prop. We really should set a default value. So down here, we'll set our default props of our heading, which is just going to be an empty string for now, right? So that's our heading. We've already destructured it from our props. So if this exists, what we'll do, right, is we will render our heading text. And then what we'll be able to do is again apply some custom class names here to style this. And again, I want to set this to be position relative. So I'm going to set the relative class. I want to set padding on the right and left axis. So again, we'll say px-2.5. I want the text color to be white. So I'm going to set the text white class. I want it to be uppercase text. So I'll give it the uppercase class. I want this to sit above other content. So I'm going to give it a Z index of 10. And then for font size, and this is very important, I'm going to set a text size for mobile, again, this is mobile first, to be text 4XL, right? I want to center it, so I'll use text center. And then on desktop, I want to have a larger font size, so I'm going to set this to a text size of 6XL. Right, so again, these are classes that I've memorized. If I show you them here, if I search here for font size, what you're going to see here is that we have 2.25 rem here, and these are the two clauses that I've applied here to my heading. So again, if we come now over to our browser, I'm getting an error. I'm just going to check why. Okay, so I've tried to set the default props here, but instead of giving it the function name of the function, I've given it the prop name. So I'll just save that change and come back over to the browser. Let's just reload, and that should work. So what you're seeing here now is I've got my hero image. It's taken up the full height of the screen just as I intended, but we're not seeing that heading text because this is passed in as a prop, and of course we're not passing that in yet. So let's come back over to app.js, which is where we render our homepage component and our layout component. So this is in our layout, so we need to pass in our heading. I'm just going to pass in TailWind CSS, right? But you can pass in anything that you like. And then we just come back over to the browser, and you'll see that this font is not really positioned how we want it to be on desktop. It should be vertically and horizontally aligned. So we need to just check those clauses that we applied on our wrapper here. And it's just a spelling error. So obviously this is align items, and I wanted to align it to the center. So this should just be an N. So that was just a spelling error. But the problem is, of course, that we can't really see the text right over the image. So usually what we do is we apply another overlay, a dark overlay, that will just sit between the image and the text and just allow you to read it a little bit more. So we give it an opacity so it's see-through, but it adds a dark layer that sits between. So to do that, underneath the H1, I'm going to just add a div, right? It's not going to have anything in the div. We're just going to apply some additional clauses here. So these clauses we're going to set this to have a Z index of 0, right? We're going to set it to be absolute. We want it to sit on the very top of the page. We want as well, we want it to sit on the far left, right? And then we want to give it 100% width. So we'll just say the height should be full, which is going to give it 100% height. And the width should be full, which is going to give it 100% width. And then we'll set the background color to be black, and we want to set the opacity to be about 40%. So when I set those clauses, what you'll see here is now we have this dark overlay that sits over the image, but under the text, so you can just read the text a little bit more clearly. And then finally, we come back over to our header. What we want to do is underneath our banner, right? Our banner wrapper, we're going to render some children. That is going to be where we render our page component. So we're going to have another div here, and we're just going to grab other props dot children, right? So this is, again, we're using the spread operator to pass in all the other props that we haven't destructured, and then we're just going to use that to render render our children. And then finally, we need to add some additional clauses there, right? So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that it's 100% width, right? So we'll just say w-full gives it 100% width, but we want to apply the same max width that we applied within our header, right? So we set a max width, if you remember here with this class, of 1280 pixels. And we want to apply that same, that's our content width. We want to apply that same width to our content section here. But what we also obviously need to do here is, again, center it. So we'll say mx, which is margin on the x-axis. X-axis is right and left of auto to center that content. Now obviously that's going to collapse at the moment because there's nothing in our page component, so there's not anything there to render. But before we actually get to the content, we need to work on our footer component. So that's the next thing that I'm going to create. So I'm going to come into my source directory, in my components folder, I'm going to create a new file. We're going to call this our footer, and then we're going to create index.js inside of that. This is going to be our footer component. It's a very simple component. We just need to import React from React. It's just going to be a functional component, of course, so it's going to be a function, right? It's going to return a HTML footer, and we can just destructure our props. So at the moment we'll just destructure and we'll just use the spread operator to get our other props. And you need to remember, of course, to have our default export of our footer. And again, this is going to be a very simple component. It's not going to take us very long to write out this component. All we need to do here is set the background color to white. We are going to then style this exactly how we styled it in our example here. So as you can see, we just have a white footer. It's got this copyright message here, which I'm going to copy. And we have some padding that sits on the top and bottom, right? So we want to replicate that in our template here. So let's come back over to our footer component, and we need to set again we're going to put in some text here and just inside of a span with just our copyright message. And again, we want to set the font size here. So again, the font size, as I mentioned before, we're going to use this text base class. It's going to apply 16 pixels, which is 1 rem. So it's equal to exactly the default font size on the browser. And then on this div here, we want to apply two things. We want to apply our class, which gives it our max width, right? Our content width. So we can actually take these classes here, just apply that here. So what this is going to do is it's going to set this to be 100% width, but it's going to have a max width of our content width, which is 1280 pixels, and it's going to center it right and left. And then all we need to do is add in some padding. So I'm going to add a padding on the right and left axes using the px, so that targets the x-axis of 2.5. And then on the top and bottom, if I just search for the padding classes, so for top and bottom, we're probably going to target the y-axis, so it will be py, and then I'm going to make it about 3.5 rem. So again, I'm going to take this class here, I'm just going to copy it, come back over to VS Code, and just paste in that class, right? So this is adding padding on the top and bottom because it's using the y-axis, and this is adding it on the left and right using the x-axis. So then all we need to do is come back over to our landing page and import our footer component. We'll import that from our components folder. So that's our footer, and then we'll just render that footer component at the bottom here. We can save that, come back over to the browser, view our page, and there you can see we now have our footer. And this is completely responsive. So if I resize this down, you'll see that we have our text there, which looks good. And again, coming back up to desktop, that looks good as well. So the last thing that we have to do, if we look at our final version here, is work on our page content, which is these 3 cards and these items here. So on desktop, we have one row with 3 columns. Tablet, we have 2 columns, and mobile, we have a single full width column going down. So we want to replicate that. Okay, so let's come back over to our text editor. Let's come back over to our page component here. And what we want to do is actually we want to return another component, right? So in our components folder, we're going to create another component called cards. So we're going to create cards, and then inside of that we'll have index.js. And inside of this, we'll just have an import statement for React. So we'll say React from React. We're going to create our function. So we'll just say const cards equals, it's just going to be a function. We're going to return For now, we'll just return a div. We're going to have a default export here for cards. And then also, of course, we want to destructure here. We'll just destructure our other props. And then what I want to do is I want to actually render this out in our page component. So in our page component over here, I'm going to import the cards component. So we'll import that from, again, our components folder. So in components, we have cards. So I actually called it card. It should be cards. So again, we're going to update our imports. So again, that imports now cards. And we just want to return that in our page component. So I already mentioned earlier in the tutorial that I have this image here that I'm going to be using within my cards. So in my cards component, I'm going to also import that. So we'll just say it's a photo, and we're going to import that again from our assets. It's going to be landscape JPG. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create those individual cards. So I'm going to create just one that we can duplicate 2 more times because the values and the markup is going to be the same. So inside of these cards, we're going to have our image. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to create another div here with an image, and then the source, so the src here, is just going to be the image that we imported. So it's the photo, and we're going to render that out just inside of a div. Then what we're going to do is we're going to create a details section within this card. So I'm going to have another div here, which is going to wrap an unordered list, and we're going to have individual list items within that, right? And basically we're just going to have a title and description. So within the first list item, we're going to have, again, we're going to have a span, and we'll just say title for now. That could be anything. And then underneath that, we'll have another one, and this will just be something like, I don't know, description, for example. And then if we actually view this again in the browser, we come over to what we're working on, you'll see what we've kind of created. So at the moment, it's just full width. It is centered because of the layout that we're using. But we also have like the title and description that sits underneath it, right? So we're kind of ready to get working on these. So what we can then do is just duplicate these cards, right? So I'm going to duplicate this 2 more times, right? But just so that it's easier to work on, I'm going to collapse these other 2, and we're only going to be working on this one individual one. But the reason that I've duplicated it is because that means we now have 3 which sit in a row, and I can start working on the styling, right? So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to apply some classes to the wrapper. I want this to be display flex. I want the flex direction to be flex row. I want to wrap it, set the flex wrap. So here we'll set flex wrap. We want to add some padding on the y-axis, that's top and bottom. So again, we're going to use py14. And again, I want to justify the content. So I'm going to say justify center. And as a result, what I'm going to be able to do, because I'm now using flex and flex row, is I'm going to be able to set a width on the children so that I can create my columns. So in each one of these cards, I'm going to create some additional styling here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply, again, because this is mobile first. On mobile, I want the width to be 100%. So I'll apply a width of full, which means on mobile, it's going to be 100%. And then I need to apply some additional classes for the various breakpoints. So for example, on tablet, which I'm going to target using the large breakpoint, I'm going to add a different width to the width I'll eventually apply to extra large, which is going to be desktop. And then finally, we need to add some other classes to do with padding. So for padding, I'm going to add a pixel. I'm going to add padding on the right and left of 2.5. And I'm going to add a margin on the bottom of 5. Right? So that's the margin taken care of. But I still need to apply a width on tablet and desktop. So let's come back over to TailWind here and let's search for width. And what I want to apply here, if I come down, is a percentage width, as I said. So what I want to apply, first of all, is going to be for tablet, which is going to be 50%. And 50% is going to give me a 2-column layout on tablet. So I'm going to take that class and I'm going to come back over to VS Code, and on the large breakpoint, I'm going to add that class. Let's come back over to TailWind, and I then want 33%, which is going to give me a 3-column layout. So I'm going to take this class, come back over to VS Code, and on desktop, so the XL, which is extra large breakpoint, we're going to apply that class. Now, before I test this in the browser, we need to actually update the styling for these other elements. So the wrapper that we are using to wrap our unordered list, we need to add some padding, again, all the way around. So I'm just going to set P-2.5. And then for the individual list items, I want to make sure that I'm removing the list style type. So again, the class name will be list-none. We're going to set that on both of these list items. So again, the class name here will be list-none. And then finally, for the span that wraps our title, we'll add a class name here of font-bold. And also we'll set the font size here using text base again. We're going to set the span that wraps the description here. We're just going to set the font size here to be text-base. And then what we'll be able to do is just grab the styling for this entire list item. And because we've applied all the classes to this card, I'm going to delete these other two that we have here that we've also collapsed. So I'm just going to delete these. And I'm also going to paste them again because we still need them. And then the one thing that I have forgotten is I do need to apply a full width class here on the image. So I'll just say w-full to the image, and that's just going to give it a width of 100%. So we'll do that for each of our cards. Let's save that and come back over to the browser. And that is looking much better. The only thing that I've noticed is that we forgot to add a white background for each of these cards. So what I'm also going to do is come back over to VS Code, and I'm going to wrap the image and the unordered list, so both of those, in another div. I'll paste them back, and I'm just going to add a class here of bg-white, and we're going to do that for each of our cards. So we need to take the image and the wrapper for our list. We need to give it another div. We're going to add another class here of bg-white, and again we'll do that as well for the last card here. So we'll just again have a div, and the wrapper needs to have this class that gives it a white background. So bg-white. Let's come back over to the browser. You'll see that looks a lot better. And there you go. So we've now pretty much built the page. Let's test this out in the browser. And you'll see that snaps to a 2-column layout. We're also centering it if there's an uneven number of items. So in this case, we have 3. So because of that, we're just centering the one on the bottom. And then on mobile, we snap this to be full width, as you can see there. And even on mobile, this is always going to be the full height of the screen, and then you'll be able to scroll and you get that nice parallax effect. The font here does seem to be a little bit small on mobile. So let's just review that. Let's come back over to our landing page, which is where we built our hero. So we have layouts, index, and this is our heading. And I think I've just missed the size. So this should be, this is the mobile font size. And as you can see, because we're using a breakpoint to override it on desktop, you can see here that we override that to a larger font size. So we missed the number there on the class. So let's save that and come back over to the browser. You'll see that that is a much more appropriate size for mobile. So you can see this is fully responsive. If you enjoyed this tutorial and would like to see more of my content, then why not subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so that you'll get notified when I release new content. I also want to let you know that I will be sharing a link in the description of this video to the GitHub repository for this project, so you can grab the source code that I've written in this tutorial directly from that link. You can find my website at simpletut.com, where I post all of my videos and courses. And the difference between watching the tutorials on YouTube opposed to my website is that on my website you can create your own personal account to track your progress through the curriculum of the course. But of course, as always, please like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to turn on notifications.